There are many drivers considered to be the greatest of all time. But how do you judge that? Do you judge it by the variety of championships won? Do you judge it by the sheer number of championships won? Or do you judge it in which driver embodies driving the most? Well, if you judge it based on the last one, the answer is a nice and simple Ayrton Senna. Born in Sao Paulo, Brazil, a young Ayrton Senna grew up as the son of a wealthy land-owning family, and on the surface it seemed he would follow those footsteps, graduating from college in 1977. But he knew his heart was somewhere else. Racing. Before he got his driver's license, he was entering local go-kart events with a homemade cart powered by a lawnmower engine. And immediately his talents were shown. He led a lot of races, but often crashed out during battles with his rivals. And by the time he graduated college, he had won the South African Karting Championship, which in turn moved him up to the World Karting Championship, and then Formula 4 in 1981 in Europe, specifically Britain, where he claimed both the British and European Formula 4 2000 championships in 1982. That moved him up to Formula 3 in 1983, and after a close championship-long battle with Martin Brundle, he won the 1983 title and began testing for Formula 1 teams. Unfortunately for Senna, the best teams that he wanted to go for, McLaren and Williams, were all full. Lotus and Brown chose their drivers politically because of sponsor obligations, which meant that Senna started Formula 1 in a relatively new, very uncompetitive Toleman team. Most of their cars didn't even qualify for the races. In fact, it was at Toleman where Senna failed to qualify. It was the only time in his career that he would not qualify because of turbo failure and some tire problems. What you need to know is that Senna made his debut at his home Grand Prix at Brazil, but DNF'd with turbo failure. Then immediately he scored his first points in South Africa, and then there was Monaco. Monaco was the tightest, narrowest, most technical, demanding track on the calendar, and it was perfect for Senna's driving style. Out of the 9 Monaco Grand Prix he entered, he won a record-setting 6 of them. And his first Monaco may have been his finest. The championship in 1984 was proving to be the way of McLaren as Niki Lauda and Alain Prost dueled for the title. But at Monaco, the stars shone on this random Toleman in this debut driver's season because it was raining. Torrentially raining. And Senna had a bit of a knack for driving in the rain. It was commonly stated that when Senna raced, it rained for everybody but him. And he used his brilliant wet weather driving skills to carve through the Monaco field, which is no easy feat at Monaco, by the way, from 13th on the grid to 2nd place. And he was closing on the leader, Prost McLaren, by over 4 seconds a lap. Now the race was ultimately stopped at lap 31 due to safety, with Prost winning, Senna finishing 2nd, but he scored fastest lap of the race, alluding to a rivalry that would bring both drivers to their knees. The same cannot be said for the rest of the Toleman series. This was the most successful Toleman would ever be. 2nd place and then a few podiums, 3rd place spots later on in the year. But this was not Senna's place. Because Lotus finally came to their senses and said, we need him to drive for us. So they bought him out of his Toleman contract, and it didn't take long to prove himself championship material. At just his 2nd race at Lotus, at the soaking wet Portuguese Grand Prix, he scored his first Grand Slam, where he qualified pole position, scored fastest lap, and led every lap of the race to victory. He lapped the entire field up to 2nd place, and finished 4th overall in the championship year. That is not bad for let's be honest, not the fastest car on the grid. It was great in a straight line, but it was nowhere near the McLarens or the Williams. 1986 started off even better, where he won the Spanish Grand Prix by less than 0.02 seconds, and he was leading the World Championship. Unfortunately, that would be the peak of his time at Lotus, because horrible Lotus reliability, hence the nickname Lots of Trouble, Usually Serious, we should know this by now, meant that he could only muster a third place overall in the championship in 1987. In fact, I would argue the best thing about the Lotus partnership was that he met his friends at Honda in 1987. And Honda and Senna grew very close, and that friendship gave Senna enough credit, along with his third place in 1987, to join the mighty McLaren team in 1988. Now, Prost may have vouched for Senna initially to get him on the team, but those beliefs that Senna would be a great number 2 for the team was quickly eroded, as Senna set out to prove that he was going to be the team's new number 1. And Senna, being Senna, decided to do this at Monaco, using the same car as Prost, a 4-time world champion, on the same track, in the same conditions. Senna out-qualified Prost by nearly 1.5 seconds. It was arguably the single greatest qualifying lap in history. And it also summed up the new Senna versus Prost rivalry very well. Senna was much faster on a race-by-race basis. However, he had a tendency to make more risky maneuvers, more irrational maneuvers on a championship standing, He made more aggressive dive bombs, may have gone a bit too fast, pushing it too hard. Meanwhile, Prost preferred to focus on the season as a whole. He has a little bit of experience with that from 1982 to 1984, and he decided to focus more on consistency rather than an outright win, and this is exactly how the race went. Senna was leading the race by over 50 seconds, breaking lap record after lap record, until lap 67, where he lost concentration and spun into the wall, allowing Prost to win the race. Senna went straight home after that. He didn't even stop by the pits, and he didn't speak to anybody for the rest of the weekend. It was probably the most embarrassing moments of his career. As for the rest of the 1988 season, well, Senna was ready to make up for that mistake, and he rewrote the rulebook. He won 8 out of 16 races that season versus Prost 7, not to mention scoring more pole positions than any other driver in a season in history. And you know what? It worked after a long, drawn-out battle, and probably the most fair, honest fight between the two that we will ever see. Senna scored his first world championship by 3 points. Now, I said this was probably the most fair and honest because as the years went by, the rivalry went from friendly competition to nasty to downright dangerous. The relationship with Prost and McLaren, and Senna especially, began eroding very fast. First, they stopped sharing information with each other on car setups. Then there was debate/proof that Senna's engineers were giving him a little bit of a helping hand in the engine department relative to Prost. And then there was Japan. It was the penultimate round of the 1989 championship, and it would decide the entire championship title. On lap 46, Senna went up the inside. He was 2/3 of the way around Prost's car, and Prost crashed into him. Both McLarens spun off the road, and Prost retired seemingly with the championship in his grasp, but Senna disagreed and got the officials to bump start him and went on to win the race and the championship. Except for the FIA president, who stated that Senna's rejoin through the runoff chicane was illegal and he was disqualified. Not only was he disqualified, he was fined and had his racing license suspended until 1990, which seems a little harsh for going through a safety chicane, but whatever. Now, if you can excuse me, let me put on my tinfoil hat for a second, because this is all circumstantial. It's never been officially proven, and no one's ever said anything about it, but It is a mighty big coincidence that the French FIA president who disqualified Senna was very good friends, talking with each other in the pits, good friends, with his French rival, Alain Prost, and it was also a coincidence that if Senna was disqualified, Prost would have the championship. Maybe, sort of, I don't know. Either way, 1990 proved to be even worse than that mess, because Prost proceeded to burn all bridges with McLaren, not just with Senna, but with Ron Dennis. There was a whole incident with a trophy and the podium. It was not healthy. So he moved to Ferrari, and the two drivers proceeded to win 11 out of 16 Grand Prix that year, and once again, for the second time in a row, it came down to the second-to-last race at Suzuka. Senna qualified pole, but then, right after he qualified pole, the pole position was moved off of the racing line onto the inside of the track. McLaren argued that it should be on the racing line because it's pole position, and the officials agreed and moved it back, but then the FIA president vetoed that and moved it back to the dirty side of the track. I don't know why he would do that, but he did that. And sure enough, Prost beat Senna off the line, and Senna wasn't going to have any of that, so he intentionally floored it into Prost at turn 1 at 170 miles an hour, taking them both off the track and giving Senna his second championship title. Yeah. It's something alright. 1990 was the high watermark, if you will, of their rivalry, as the 1991 Ferrari was very uncompetitive, and Prost could only muster 5th, and then he proceeded to get fired by Ferrari because he said their car was terrible. So the rivalry would instead be at Nigel Mansell with his revolutionary Williams FW14, in which for the third time in a row, the title came down to the Japanese Grand Prix, the second-to-last race of the season, only with less dramatics because Senna was able to hold off the charging Mansell before the Williams' brakes gave out, giving Senna his third title in just 4 years. Now, by contrast, McLaren in 1992 and 1993 were sort of hopeless. The Williams tech-focused domination was quite simply unbeatable. Mansell won in 1992 and Prost won in 1993, and McLaren was sort of there. Senna really only stayed there because of his loyalty to Honda in 1992, and because he couldn't get a drive in the Williams because of Prost's clause prohibiting Senna from being his teammate in 1993. Despite this, Senna gave us one of his all-time best drives at Donington. It was the European Grand Prix. Rain was falling and he was racing against some legends, Damon Hill, Alain Prost, Michael Schumacher, who were all in much, much faster cars, and he was starting in 4th. And very quickly he fell through the grid on the flag drop, but by the end of the first lap, in less than a minute, he was in the lead. And he went on to set the outright track record in the wet and win the race in an uncompetitive McLaren by over a minute. Say what you will about the guys, crashing into each other to win the championship, but this man could frickin' drive. But his time at McLaren was finally done in 1993, when he moved to Williams in 94. Prost had retired with a championship in 93, and Senna took his spot. But the rules were changing. All that fancy tech that made the Williams so OP was gone, forced out by new rules. So what was left was poor. Senna was not exactly confident with the car, and it showed in the first 2 races. He retired twice. And then came race 3. The weekend began with a dark cloud at the San Marino Grand Prix at Imola. It was one of the fastest, most daring tracks in modern F1 history, and during Friday practice, Jordan driver Rubens Barrichello crashed at 95G and was sent to the hospital with a sprained arm and a broken nose, which, for hitting a wall at 95G, sort of gave everybody a false sense of security. If you could do that, then these things are tanks. You're unstoppable. But that all came to a halt on Saturday when SimTech driver Roland Ratzenberger had a front wing failure that speared him into the barrier at 195 miles an hour. He was pronounced dead while in the hospital. Ratzenberger's death devastated the community. It was the first racing fatality since 1982, and it really messed with everybody, Senna especially. During a chat with his friend's F1 chief Dr. Sid Watkins, he broke down into tears with Sid saying, and I'm quoting Sid directly, "You have been a world champion 3 times. You're obviously the quickest driver. Give it up and let's go fishing." Senna refused and got into the car on Sunday. After a start line crash that caused minor injuries to 9 spectators, because this is San Marino 94 after all, the race was restarted, but just 7 laps in, Senna's car suddenly speared off the road and hit the wall at 145 miles an hour. Normally a perfectly survivable impact, but the car hit the wall at just the right angle, so that the suspension and the tire flew off and hit him in the head. It severed his temporal artery, punctured his helmet, and striking his head against the headrest. Sid arrived on the scene and immediately saw massive brainstem damage, and Senna was airlifted to the hospital where he was pronounced dead. When they were cleaning up the debris, they saw a furled up Austrian flag in Senna's car for Ratzenberger. The deaths at Imola in '94 sent shockwaves through the motorsport world. They were, as I mentioned, the first fatalities in motorsport since 1982, but it finally led to Formula One knuckling down and tackling safety head-on. So much, in fact, was done for safety that F1 wouldn't have another fatality until 2014. So, I mean, his deaths were not in vain, I guess, if you have to look at some positive aspect. When he arrived in Brazil, as his funeral attracted over 3 million people in one of the largest processions in history, and Senna has been considered by his peers and his rivals as the greatest racing driver of all time. Now, why? Both Schumacher and Prost and Hamilton and Vettel and all those all have more than 3 titles. But few have eclipsed his feeling of driving. For Senna, he didn't drive for money or statistics or trophies. He drove for himself. As he put it, when he drove, he was entering a different realm of existence, ethereal plane, if you will. And he was also millimetrically perfect. Not just behind the wheel, but in the setups. He was renowned for his attention to detail almost as much as his track exploits. But it was more than that. More than on the track. You see, instead of spending his Formula One winnings on evading taxes and buying Pagani's that he'll never drive, Senna gave away millions to the struggling citizens of Brazil. He was considered to be more of a humanitarian than a racing driver. And arguably more importantly, he served as a beam of positivity for the darkness of Brazil. Like, the country and its people were broke, starving, and had very little to look up for. But he was that outlet. They could look up to him and say, that is the best that Brazil has to offer. To emphasize how much he is missed, in 2000 he was inducted into the Motorsport Hall of Fame, and since his death in '94, every single Williams F1 team logo has incorporated an S into their car in honor of Senna. And McLaren named their ultimate track car after Senna, which it always seems fitting. That car was designed to be the fastest car on any track, anywhere, anytime, while still having license plates on, and I think it's a rather fitting tribute. And that's not the only road car he has been involved in, directly or indirectly. His relationship with Honda led to him fine-tuning the suspension and the chassis of the Honda NSX, which is considered one of the best handling sports cars of its day and one of the best Japanese sports cars of all time. I'm gonna be honest. I'm more of a Jim Clark fan. I think his era of driving was even more dangerous, and his smoothness and his ability to deal with any class of car in any situation makes him the best driver of all time, in my opinion. But in terms of being a driver, in terms of being almost religiously involved behind the wheel, there is no better example, both in terms of character and skill, as the great Ayrton Senna.